Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on positive alternative suspension. Today, we are so excited to get started and talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we've done here at Boys Town campus and some of the things that we have to offer and some best practices during this webinar. My name is Mike Meeks, and I'm currently the training manager for Boys Town National Community Services. We have the opportunity to work with hundreds of schools across the country and train thousands of educators all throughout the year. And my co-presenter today is Steph Jensen, and I will let her introduce herself.
My name's Steph Jensen, and I started my journey in education, if you will, as a middle school teacher almost 20 years ago. I went from there to being a reading specialist and then started working directly for Boys Town, doing some work working with schools and other agencies across the country, and that has encapsulated about 15 years of my experience in education, working here with Boys Town. If you're not familiar with Boys Town, a little bit of information about us as an organization. We were started in 1917 by Father Edward Flanagan with the mission really to change the way American cares for their children, families, and communities by providing and promoting a continuum of care that instills those Boys Town values for both body, mind, and spirit. We carry out Father Flanagan's mission by delivering a pro-social, proven social and emotionally based behavior model that supports children, families, communities, and schools. We work hard to provide those specific strategies to fulfill that need for those multi-tiered interventions in schools. And so as we talk today, we'll be referencing those different tiers and different levels of needs behaviorally and academically for our kids and how that fits into our overall model of care. The interventions that we provide are research supported. We are currently conducting some research, doing a research grant in partnership with Iowa State University. But many years of research has gone into our overall model of care that is what our education model is built upon. So for over 100 years, Boys Town worked really to strengthen communities as we support children and families seeking healing from trauma, relational challenges, mental health concerns, and we do this by providing a range of services to meet children and families really where they are in their level of need, level of care. Really hoping to serve them with that greatest capacity for the greatest change. We also work really hard to empower schools to help them deal with that ever-increasing challenges, both behaviorally and academically, that present themselves in classrooms every day. Our research-driven education model provides those programs to create that safe and connected environment. So really looking at helping educators develop those skills necessary to support that academic success through behavioral interventions and strategies, really to keep them in the classroom. So when we look at that overall, the overall mission, the primary mission of a school system to educate students, to provide that civil right of a public education, creating that environment where they're safe, where they're nurtured, where they feel valued, where they feel connected. We want to help the schools to adopt discipline policies that outline some of those codes of conduct so that kids know what those behavioral expectations are, but beyond knowing what those expectations are, knowing how to achieve those expectations. I think sometimes that's where we see that really big gap in we create these behavioral expectations, we create our universal expectations, but sometimes we leave out the how to achieve those behavioral expectations. And so then that leads to discipline policies. And when we look at discipline policies, all schools have some sort of discipline policies on record that guide how we interact and address behavior. And these things range anywhere from just having a corrective conversation to larger types of consequences such as out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, and even expulsion. And what we're finding is that a lot of times when we don't have basic strategies to address those behaviors when they're small, we find them getting big much more quickly, and we're moving to those larger consequences, such as the out-of-school suspension in-school suspension and expulsion. We want to look at ways that we can reduce those larger consequences, keeping kids in the classroom as much as possible and helping them to learn how to manage their own behaviors. So when we talk about suspensions, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions, just kind of looking at those basic definitions. We're looking at in-school suspensions. They can be a range of days within that school environment. Out-of-school suspensions, again, oftentimes denial of attendance for 10 days or less. And then expulsion would be anything over 10 days. Sometimes that expulsion, sometimes we also are seeing kiddos being placed into alternative settings. So let's look at kind of where this all began. Why are we jumping to those larger consequences more quickly, or why are we finding some of that? And when we talk about zero tolerance, we see that zero tolerance was adopted in the 80s and 90s, really with the goal to address the increased concerns around school violence. We're seeing more school violence, and so wanted to take some action to address those larger behaviors. Specifically, was tied more specifically to those most egregious types of behaviors with weapons and physical harm. So again, when we look at this, the intentions were good. There was a problem. We wanted to address that. But what we're finding is that where the devil came into the details, when we start seeing these zero tolerance policies being assigned or attached to smaller level behaviors. And so we've all seen in the news some of those headlines where kids are suspended for chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Little kids using, making a gun sign with their hands and being suspended and expelled for those behaviors. And what that leads to is an increase in school dropouts. We see a decrease in academic achievement, and we also see that decrease in students' ability to be career ready, to be able to enter that workforce. And when we break those numbers down, we really look at those suspensions and expulsions, we see that they really are affecting at much higher levels our boys in our schools, as well as, and not only boys, but boys of color. Seeing that they receive the highest number of suspensions and expulsions. And we see this at earlier and earlier ages. In 2016, the National Survey of Children's Health put out a report looking at the number of students that are expelled from preschool. And when they put all the data together of expulsions, suspensions and expulsions from preschool, they found that there were about 50,000 suspensions and expulsions in 2016. And they also found that what that averaged out to is approximately 250 preschoolers are being expelled every single day. And so we think about that, and we think that, and understand that if kids are suspended or expelled even one time, they are twice as likely to drop out of school at some point. So think what that does, what we're communicating to our kids. They're expelled, the first time they're expelled is at preschool. And also think about what that communicates to the parents and to the community when we're expelling the youngest among us from our public schools. We know that one suspension is twice, if you receive one suspension, you're twice as likely to repeat that within 3 months. And with one suspension, you're over two times more likely to be incarcerated. And so you think about when all this started, in the 80s and 90s, we started applying these zero tolerance policies. That's also when we started looking at and starting to see the effects that school to prison pipeline. And that has been accelerated over the last 20, 30 years in seeing more and more of these kids that are suspended or expelled at such a young age, and then their long-term options really are reduced. The other thing about these zero tolerance policies and suspensions and in school or out of school suspensions is that we kind of lose sight on what the purpose was. And so if we look at the reason that kids are suspended or expelled, it's generally because of behaviors. And the behaviors are the things that we teach the least. We spend so much time focusing on the academics, and we're not giving them the knowledge that they need to develop those social emotional learning capacities that are necessary for them to be successful, not only in our schools, but outside of our schools as well. And so with those suspensions and expulsions, we find that really it doesn't deter or improve those behaviors, because it oftentimes is a reinforcer. When they're suspended from school, they don't have to get up in the morning. They get to stay home all day. They get to do what they want to do. They have less supervision. And so those behaviors continue to escalate, and they maintain those inappropriate or unacceptable behaviors. And so until someone steps in and teaches them an alternative behavior, we're going to see them kind of stuck in this cycle of continuing escalation of those behaviors. Again, we look at consequences. Punitive measures do not change behavior. So punishment will not change behavior. If punishment changed behavior, we would have no recidivism in our prison system. But punishment can't change behavior. Punishment can stop behavior as long as that punisher is there or present. As soon as that punisher goes, they still don't know what behavior they should be engaging in. So until we teach that alternative behavior, they're going to continue in that cycle of failure. So as we look at the data, we look at where we've come from and where we are with zero tolerance and these higher levels of suspensions and expulsions, we want to focus to what is an alternative? What are some of those alternatives to these high-level consequences? And what can we do if our goal is to help them be more successful, not only in school, but within the community? How can we use this time, this time of suspension or alternatives to being in the classroom? How can we use that time better to intentionally address the need or the reason that they were placed in that level of need in the first place? And so I'm going to pass it over to Mike to talk a little bit about our positive alternatives to suspension intervention.
So like Steph was saying, Boys Town really saw that the overwhelming evidence across the nation was that suspensions and expulsions were increasing. It wasn't necessarily changing the student behavior, and there needed to be a difference. So in 2009, we started looking at what kind of programming would help support some of that student learning and also decrease some of that the suspensions and expulsions and the overuse of some of those consequences. So in 2009, we looked at, okay, so what is our primary goal if we're going to look at what is an alternative suspension? First thing we wanted to look at was we wanted to increase students' use of appropriate behavior to achieve social and academic success while retaining the safety for all students. We definitely wanted to see that. When you look at suspensions, usually for some of those bigger problem behaviors that are absolutely issues with safety and also the frequency of behaviors. So what we looked at is what within our model could support that. So we wanted to take an evidence-based approach to modifying those student behaviors. We wanted to provide professional support for those academic and behavior teaching and make sure that we help those students with the social emotional outcomes that they're looking for, so some of those suspensions would decrease over time and also hopefully not come back. So what we wanted to look at is we wanted to decrease that amount of student suspension and create a program where students are in a program with high expectations and low tolerances. They process the events resulting in the suspension, so it's not necessarily just having kids leave our school, but also we wanted to make sure that they identify what was some of those problem behaviors, and we can work through some of those things and teach some of those social emotional skills versus just going home or just going to a room and not interacting a whole lot. And also we want students to actively practice some of those things. And we want to look at what is it a target or a skill deficit? So when we looked at our programming, we wanted to make sure that if we were to export it out, or also working with other schools within our area, we wanted to make sure that it was part of a discipline matrix within a multi-tiered system of support. So again, what are those tiers within a school system that can provide the most support for kids to reduce the suspensions? But if that was a necessary consequence, how does it fit within your own school discipline matrix? Also, we wanted to provide an alternative to traditional in-school suspension and also out-of-school suspensions. What we did was looked at Boys Town program of positive alternatives to suspension. If you look at traditional ISS or OSS versus kind of the model we came up with, traditional ISS and OSS is absolutely a high-level consequence. It is oftentimes used to remove potentially dangerous students from the classroom, or sometimes students that make one of those bigger whoops mistakes, or some of those zero tolerance policies, sometimes used for kids that are more frequent behavior concerns. Oftentimes those traditional areas are unstructured time away from school or in a self-contained room. And the focus is time away as the deterrent. So we're under the impression that a suspension or school system is the most reinforcing thing that kids can or kids have. And if we take that away, then that's the deterrent. So when we look at our positive alternative suspension, or the way we look at things, yes, absolutely, we want that to be our highest level of consequence in a discipline matrix. We still want to be able to remove potentially dangerous students from the classroom, but we want to make sure that that is very structured time, predictable learning, and students work on both social and academic learning. And our focus is successful reintegration back into the academic environment with some of that social-emotional skill teaching. So some key components. It provides a positive alternative to support that multi-tiered system of support that we were talking about. It's a high-level consequence for inappropriate behavior that teaches those pro-social skills and provides a structured environment with high expectations, low tolerances, and again focuses on that academic and skill teaching. Whenever a student earns a suspension, we want to make sure that we problem solve that ongoing behavior, teach those pro-social behaviors, and what we find is that students that earn a significant number of suspensions or even one suspension often fall behind academically, and sometimes those suspensions are a result of their academic deficits. So they remove themselves from class because they can't do the work. So we want to make sure that they keep up academically, but also this type of programming would still be a deterrent because of the type of work they would be doing, and also they are removed from class still. So our goals is to increase the use of appropriate behaviors, safety for students in the school, and also safety for the students that are working through the positive intervention program. We also want to make sure that we have individualized plans for students coming into the program, which is another thing that we looked at. So first of all, why are they suspended, and how do we craft that time to be time engaged versus time away? So we want to create individualized plans and also have high expectations for their continued support, and also, of course, low tolerances. So we do that with some reflective tools. We provide lots of social-emotional support through the use of role play, paperwork, and also specific skill teaching. When we're thinking about this program, the first thing, again, we wanted to look at is how do we integrate this into what schools are currently doing. So whenever we look at, or some of the schools that we work with, typically their continuum of referral consequences start with some type of, as long as it's not an egregious policy violation, they would start with some type of initial report. So it would be a conversation with the administrator, potentially a consequence, maybe a detention, maybe some restitution. Oftentimes they'll look at, so if I could do some contracting with some students, what does that look like if I do this same behavior again? What we want to look at is, okay, so what are the steps that we can implement to make sure that students have an opportunity for that social emotional learning? So we want to look at potentially having some contracting procedures in place. So for those students that have those behaviors that are more frequent but less severe, so the behaviors that are continuing to be disruptive in class, those behaviors that are frequent headache for a lot of administrators because the teachers don't necessarily know what to do with those students, we want to look at, so how can we make that time purposeful both in the office and also in class, but contract. So what that might look like is if student A earns a consequence for being disruptive in class and the teacher sends the student out to the office. We would have a purposeful conversation as an administrator during that referral, and then we might contract for additional consequences, and that could include some more of the social emotional work, or it could be a positive alternative suspension. So we look at that as this is your opportunity to correct your behavior versus just dropping the hammer right away. This gives students a little bit of opportunity to govern themselves, govern their behavior, and also teach them how to control their behavior over time. Our big ideas whenever we're thinking about behavior are that behavior can be taught. So if a student has an issue or a social emotional deficit, we feel strongly that we can teach an alternative replacement behavior. We also feel very strongly that whenever students work with another adult and are able to reflect on some of their behaviors through writing or role play, that stimulates a whole lot of critical thinking and also creates some of the brain pathways for students to have better problem solving. The next thing we looked at outside of making sure that this matched with a lot of discipline matrix is also staffing, because it's important to have the right person in place to be able to effectively change behavior whenever you're thinking about a positive alternative suspension program. So within our programming, we made a specific job description or an overview of a job description that would fit perfectly with this type of person. Now, a lot of school districts don't have a specific person that would run that type of thing, but we have a set of expectations for staff that would allow you to provide that would provide you be able to use a multiple resources that you might have within your school already to create some of those individualized suspension plans for students and be able to enact some of those, support students with both academic and behavior learning during that suspension time, and also provide you with a really great opportunity to document and also keep some of those records so that you can track data over time and make some more of those informed decisions on behavior. We would highly recommend that those staff members go through a required training, and then a smaller ratio of students to staff is often more effective. So we often say a ratio is 5-to-1 students to 1 teacher or staff member. And again, that's a guideline. Sometimes that works in your space and place, sometimes it does not. So that's some of the guidelines that we came up with for our programming. The other thing that's very important is making sure that the environment that the kids are going into is predictable. So in our programming, we wanted to look at, okay, so what is absolutely necessary? We want to make sure that the environment that they're going into as an alternative to suspension allows them the opportunity to work through some classroom skills, not just sit in a room and not necessarily be able to practice things in a real life environment. We want to make sure that we have rules and expectations. We want to keep them limited. We want to make sure that they're manageable and enforceable, but we want to make sure that it's as predictable as possible and aligns with whatever's going on in your current school or system and the classrooms that they came from. So after a student is in an alternative suspension program, we felt very strongly that we want to make sure again that that time is purposeful. It's not just time away, it's time engaged. So we work with our staff members to create individualized positive alternative suspension plans, which would include the data from their referral behavior. So it could potentially be a referral report or any type of information system that you currently have. We want to make sure that those are behaviorally specific plans and also behaviorally specific on what their deficits might be. We also want to look at what is the intensity, frequency, or duration of that behavior. We also want to take a look at, over time, is this a skill deficit or is this a performance deficit? Now, what we know is that performance deficits are very hard to manage and are also hard to track because we can't necessarily look inside a child's head. So we often focus on it's a skill deficit over a performance deficit. After we look at all that data, why is the student in here? What are their preceding events? What are some of those antecedents? We want to make sure that we identify a specific plan and teach some skills to match a lot of their deficits. So again, that time is focused again on academic and social emotional teaching. So how do we know if it's a skill deficit versus a performance deficit? A skill deficit is the student doesn't know the skill or the appropriate behavior. Whenever we look at that, we would focus on that specific skill teaching and reinforce approximations of that behavior. So we want to look at change over time. If it truly is a performance deficit, then the difference would be that that student knows the appropriate skill or behavior but chooses not to use it. Our focus in that situation would be on reteaching of behavior and skill, but we also know for those types of students that have a performance deficit, that skill change takes a long time or longer for them because it's often about reinforcement. Also, with a performance deficit student, we might look at what is a motivation system because, again, that behavior goes back to reinforcement. Sometimes the negative behavior is more reinforcing than the positive behavior. So when we look at creating some of those specific behavioral plans, when we're looking at programming, these are the things we look at so that we can make that time purposeful. In addition, we want to make sure that there's opportunity to communicate with the classroom teacher or teachers that they came from, and also the administration if they're not part of this process. So we looked at behavior monitoring. What does that look like? And we wanted to make sure that that process is as manageable as possible, but also as a really great communication tool. So we can communicate with the classroom teacher, administrators, and also potentially that past teacher. And we developed a very simple tracking card for that. Now, after a student has had their time in a positive alternative suspension environment, we want to make sure that whenever they do go back, that they go back successfully. All too often, sometimes kids will show up just in a classroom with a classroom teacher after a suspension, and it's kind of jarring for that classroom teacher. So what happened? What did they do? What was the consequence? What was the outcome? So what we want to make sure that we support, and whenever we looked at our programming, one huge thing that we wanted to support was that positive reentry. So whenever a student goes back, when we look at our program, is we want to make sure that they have a specific behavior plan for each student that's individual. Now, we know that behavior plans are sometimes impossible for teachers to manage because, again, they have a large number of students in their class, and if you have too many plans but too many specific things, then it's impossible to manage. So when we talk about behavior planning, we want to make sure that we set up specific strategies for teachers that align with whatever behavior model that they currently have. And it's just really reminders about adult behavior. Now, the student is always part of this process, so we want to make sure that we set goals for them and also set up some individualized support. So what can they do whenever they're feeling a specific way, or what supports are currently in the school that they can go to? That plan will always be written out, and it goes back to all pertinent parties that we need to communicate with. And we reevaluate any of these plans every 2 weeks. We came up with this programming, we looked at best practice, what would work for us, so we decided that it would be time to implement it. So we have two programs that we're currently running. One is the Metro Intervention Center here in the Omaha area. It started in 2015, and we work with 12 school districts in the Omaha community. So what happens is that school districts will contract out with Boys Town, our organization, and if a student is suspended for 19 days or less, then they will come to Boys Town versus going home. And what that looks like is we have specific staff. We have 2 special education certified teachers and a paraprofessional and a behavior interventionist to take care of any ongoing or escalated behavior. And we have a 30 student capacity. Whenever the students are in this programming, they're focused on social-emotional and also academic learning. So we want to focus on both of those things, specific behavior plans, and sending them back with behavior plans whenever they do go back. So 30 students typically at a time is our max that we're looking at. And we have 2 classrooms that we currently run in that program. And the other program that we have going on is our one of the largest high schools here in the Omaha area, and it is a title school. So we partnered with this school specifically to be an alternative suspension for them. We focus specifically for freshman and sophomore students when we're looking at our high school programming, because again, we feel like if we can affect change on the front end, then they're less likely to have issues. And what we find with the South High, most kids are suspended for things like truancy and not completing academic work. When we look at this program, it's a parent's choice. So they can decide if a suspension is issued, in school or out of school suspension. The parents can decide to send them to the Boys Town program, or they can go home. This is staffed with a special education teacher and a paraprofessional, and we have about 10 to 15 students capacity for this one at any given time. What were the results? So again, the Metro Intervention Center has been running for about 4 years now, and the South High program also the same amount of time. And with the Metro Intervention Center, we've been working with 12 school districts. In those 12 school districts, we have seen pretty consistent results. We've seen a 23% reduction in the total number of suspension days over that time period. We've seen a 43% reduction in the total number of students earning repeat suspensions. We've seen a 78% reduction in the number of suspensions for students verified as special ed, and a 40% reduction in the number of minority students suspended. So what we found is that the programming that we created has been very successful and really doing a nice job of increasing or decreasing some of those suspension and also increasing that academic engagement. What we have the opportunity to do now is, since we've tested this in our own environments and we've looked at what is best practice, we've looked at what is it like working with other school districts, and we've tested those things out. Now we have the opportunity to disseminate that across the country. So Boys Town National Community Services now has a positive alternative suspension training that we offer. This training is 2 days, and in that 2 days, educators will go through each one of the things that I talked about. We will talk about how to implement this into your discipline matrix, how to staff, how to set up expectations and room setup, how to monitor behavior and communicate academic and behavioral needs, how to write those individualized plans, how to write those plans whenever students re-enter the classroom. So what we feel like is this is a very good program and has had some consistent success. So we feel that this program would be great for any school district. So with that training, again, that's a 2-day training. You'll receive the Positive Alternative Suspension textbook, also Teaching Social Skills to Youth book. And that 2 days is really a work session, because we really want to make sure that this fits for your space and place, and also either your school or your school district, if you wanted to create a program within your own school, or if you wanted to create a district-wide program. How do you get buy-in from teachers who want the answer to be suspension? So when we look at teachers, what they really want is results, right? So we always want to see that the consequence was big enough to, number one, meet the need, or to be punishing enough so that the behavior doesn't continue. What we found is that the buy-in has increased because the behavior has decreased. So even though it may feel like this consequence is not as big, the learning is better, and the social-emotional skills have increased, so the classroom behavior improves. And that's really what teachers are looking for. Does the consequence improve classroom behavior? And what we found is that it does in most cases, and also so that buy-in really works itself out. Because really, there's a lot of misconception about what happens whenever kids go to the office. They don't go to the office just to have conversations and eat candy and have a good time. We do a lot of things. So we want to make sure that that's time. And also, the other big piece of this programming is that communication piece. So they know what happened or what's happening.
Yeah, and Mike, don't you think too that the reentry plan is another piece that kind of gets that buy-in from staff? And like you said, when kids are in a purposeful environment during that time of suspension is still an option. It's just that we're doing it within a structured environment that is going to improve what caused the need for that suspension in the first place. So again, you see more of that buy-in because you see an improvement in the behaviors, whereas suspension on its own in the historic way or the way that it's being applied right now, it does nothing to improve those behaviors. Going back to that reentry piece, I really like, as you look at the four pieces of that process for reentry, and the first one is that behavior planning. And you think about social emotional learning and how we're trying to really bridge the ability to intentionally address or develop those social emotional capacities. That first piece of reentry is self-awareness. So what is your plan? What is that going to be, which then leads to that goal setting, which is self-management. So you have kind of these core components of social emotional learning, those first two, the foundational components, if you will, of social emotional learning being intentionally addressed and developed through part of this plan. And then when you do those individual supports, identifying those individual supports, that's that third level of the scaffold of social awareness. So right there, just in this one piece of this overall intervention, you're addressing three different areas of social emotional learning, which we know is going to help kids be more successful academically and socially.
The two programs that we run, one is an absolute temporary placement outside of their normal school placement, but within the South High program that we run, it is a placement within their normal school placement. Because we provide both academic and behavioral support, it doesn't count towards their 10 days of suspension if a student's on an individualized education plan, because it isn't necessarily an alternative placement. So we could work with a district to create an alternative placement, or we could work with a school to create a specific program within your school. So it could be twofold. So we do it both ways. Whenever we look at positive alternative suspension, we want to make sure that, again, that behavior tracking is in place. So we've developed a point card, if you will, that talks a little bit about social emotional skills on one side, that focuses on what are those skill deficits, and we record those as a 1, 2, or 3. So did they achieve, did they not achieve, or they achieved most of the time. So again, when we look at that tracking, we want to make sure that we reinforce those behaviors. So again, that reinforcement is done on card, the correction is done on card as a communication. However, we wouldn't necessarily set up a reward system within the positive alternative suspension program, but we would potentially set up a motivation system outside of the programming. So we want to make sure that we always want to make the classroom the most reinforcing place that we have versus the alternative suspension program. There was another question about how about a very small rural district that lacks resources and staffing. So within a smaller school or a smaller district, we can work with the current resources that you often have. So we've set up some things when we're working with some schools where they can potentially rotate teachers around on specific rotating bases to manage these classrooms, to provide, again, it's important to be able to provide a lot of that academic support. So it's important that you have a certified teacher that does that, and also the behavior work. So you can share duties and still make this successful.
Yeah, like you said, I think that you can use the resources that are there. The thing I like about this also is that it's a nice fit for a tier 2 intervention. And so you can use this as a framework for your in-school suspension room within a school, individual school, but you can also use it as a framework for an alternative setting. This might not be enough, like you said, if you're looking at the differences between skill deficits and performance deficits that need for a motivation system. So we also have training specifically for that highest level, that tier 3, to help integrate a motivation system consistently and really objectively, that we provide training on as well, called specialized classroom management. And so these two together work nicely in tandem for a comprehensive programming within a district to address those highest levels of needs and keep kids in the classroom.
There is another question about recidivism. So with programming like this, do we find that students go in and out of this program? What we find is that students don't, because again, what they're looking for is that skill building. So again, once they find those skills, and also with those reentry plans, we make sure that we set up We set up resources for them to go to whenever they're struggling or have needs versus creating an environment where they need only us to manage their behavior or that alternative setting to manage that behavior. So whenever we look at those reentry plans, we're very intentional about looking at, so what are the places in school, in the regular school environment that can provide those supports. Can you speak specifically to how PASS works with students that choose to avoid school? Truancy. So again, when we worked with the South High program, we really wanted to look at how can we reduce the amount of those kids that are truant. And what we find is that there's a lot of outside things going on for those specific students that cause them to not come to school. So again, with those reentry plans or that specific PASS intervention, we want to make sure we look at what are those external environments that are causing them not to come to school. Is that because they're not getting up in the morning because they're staying up too late? So again, that's a social emotional skill deficit. Are they not able to find a ride to school? We can look at some external resources to potentially help with that. Is it a family-based issue? Again, we want to look at sometimes some of those things are outside supports. However, if a student's not coming to school, we also want to look at what are those internal things in school. So is it an academic deficit? Are they behind so far that they don't want to come to school because they don't think they can ever get out? So again, providing that academic support within that positive alternative suspension time frame, time engaged versus time away, sometimes helps them catch up to feel more confident in going to class. Also, whenever we look at those reentry plans or those specific plans, what are the things inside the school that are causing them not to want to go to school? So there are a lot of things that we can work with and work for whenever we're looking at reducing the amount of truancy. Now, I'm not saying that this is the program that will absolutely work 100% of the time. If I did, I would be absolutely lying to you. But we have found that we have increased attendance rates significantly with those freshmen and sophomore students that have those continued suspensions for that for truancy and not coming to school.
Yeah, and I think that this communicates, just having this process in place and identified, it communicates to kids that we want them there. And all kids are looking for some level of connection. And so the more that we provide those opportunities to intentionally connect, that does provide motivation to come to school. It makes it more of a reinforcing place instead of a punishing place.
We're really proud of some of the things that we've worked on here, and we would love to partner with some of the schools that you have out there to share some of this.
Thank you to everyone for joining us. Like Mike said, we would love to talk with you further about this specific intervention strategy of positive alternatives to suspensions and the continuum of different training options that Boys Town provides. So if you are interested in more information, the contact information is on the screen. Thank you again.